Hello, and welcome to today's special webinar event, Truth or Dare of Identity Security. Today's webinar is sponsored by Attivo Networks and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for today's event. Now, before we get to today's exciting content, there are a few things you should know about this webinar. First off, we want this to be a very educational event for you, so we encourage all questions in the question box in our webinar control panel. And not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you will find some information from Attivo Networks, as well as details about the Actual Tech Guerrilla Guide Book Club and a link to the Actual Tech Media Event Center. So I encourage you to download those resources and share them with your friends and colleagues. And third, at the end of this event, we'll be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. So if you're watching this on replay, sorry, the drawing has already occurred. But if you are the winner, you can choose to donate the value of the card to one of our selected charities. And thanks to generous prize winners on previous events, thousands of dollars have been donated to various charities. And so you can select one of those charities and make your donate your prize to a charity as well. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found at actualtechmedia.com. So scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So we have a special promotion to encourage you to ask that pressing question rather than keeping it to yourself. It's an additional prize. It's another Amazon gift card. This one for $50 for the best question. And at the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best, and contact that prize winner. So with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So our presenters today are Carolyn Crandall, Chief Security Advocate from Attivo Networks, and John O'Neill, who's Chief Information Security Officer at Molded Fiberglass. And before I formally introduce them, I just want to explain what you're going to see here today. Carolyn was looking for a CISO to join her in an event and talk about what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And I know John from years of hosting presentations with him and thought he might be a great fit. So we'll talk about some big, real issues going on right now in identity security. And then what's unique about this session is that because I knew John, but he wasn't an Attivo customer already, it was an opportunity for John to try their tools and give a fresh perspective on the kind of security issues that spotlighted for him. So that's where the truth or dare concept comes in. Should be a really interesting discussion for you over the next hour. But with that, let me just welcome Carolyn and John. Carolyn, welcome. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. It's great to be here today, and the truth or dare. I loved this topic and John's willingness to play. So I'm excited about what we can share with everybody today.
It should be a lot of fun. And John, good to see you. Welcome.
Good to see both of you, Scott, Carolyn. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks again. Identity security is near and dear to my heart, so I've had a lot of fun with our conversation so far, and I can't wait to get into it today.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's jump ahead here. We talked a little bit about the agenda already, but I guess we'll just in a little more detail. We're going to talk about some truths. Why identity security is a 2021 priority, conditions that are fueling identity attacks, and some information about visibility tools. And then we'll get to the dare as far as the test drive and real world experiences. And then, as we talked about before, any questions that you have, we'll try to save some time for those too. And so we'll get to some Q&A as well. So let's jump right into it. So we're talking about identity security, and so there was a recent survey, and maybe Carolyn, can you talk a little bit just quickly about this survey and where the data came from, and then we'll get into some of the results.
Yeah, absolutely. So EMA is Enterprise Management Associates. They're an analyst firm that, given all the attention after the SolarWinds and the congressional hearings, they thought, look, people need to understand what the challenges are with Active Directory. So what better to do than to go out and survey about 250 security professionals and ask them, right? What is the kind of conditions in the market around Active Directory security? What are the challenges and how are people dealing with those challenges? And so these are some of the outputs you hear. And what was particularly refreshing to me was that people are actually looking to invest, right? 86% are looking to invest in Active Directory security improvements based upon, over half of them had been attacked in the last couple of years. 42% were successful. Pen testers are getting through. There's all these challenges, and we'll talk about a lot of them today. And they capture a lot of rich information. So the report is available to anybody that wants to get a copy of that and download it. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's quite interesting. A few surprises were inside of there.
Yeah, definitely. And let's go to one of those. You'd mentioned that 86% of respondents sharing that they're increasing their spending on Active Directory. And so, John, let me ask you: does it surprise you the number of successful attacks that are occurring and the amount of success that attackers are having?
Unfortunately, Scott, it doesn't surprise me. Right? We just have to look at a little historical perspective. Active Directory was really born 20 plus years ago with the advent of Windows 2000. And in that era, a lot of what IT focused on when it came to identity management was all about convenience, right? Convenience for the customer, convenience for the users on the network, and that sort of thing. And then it just evolved forward through iteration after iteration. You saw a lot of when Bill Gates came out and made his famous commitment to security first approaches, and they implemented all these group policy settings that would start securing Active Directory. And then I can't tell you how many peers I would run into, and they were basically just going through and systematically turning them off because they were driving their users nuts. And so the result of that is we take that occurred over decades, and then we look at the last 2 years where nation state malware has become a thing, where ransomware has become an everyday event. And it was just, everything was teed up for a home run there for the attackers. And now a lot of us in IT, we've got to play catch up. We've got to undo a lot of that. So it doesn't surprise me at all that credentials are being breached at this point.
Gotcha. So that's a deep pull on, what was that, trustworthy computing, and I think 2001, Bill Gates. Yeah. So
you got it.
How should CISOs be reacting to this risk, do you think?
Well, so, one of the things that I say often, both internally in meetings and then externally to others, is cybersecurity in 2021 and looking forward to 2022 is a zero-sum game. We have to pitch a shutout, okay? Because infections, breaches, they don't just destroy our data or access to our systems. They destroy our credibility with our customers, with our stakeholders, with our users. They have the potential to destroy careers. And so, this isn't about, oh, I got breached, I'm a little bit inconvenienced. This is, a much higher stakes game. We're sitting at the high stakes table now. So CISOs need to be taking credential management absolutely serious now, because it's the foundation stone upon which all their other security is built. Name for me, take 100 breaches that have occurred, and I bet you would be hard pressed to find even 5% of those that didn't involve some sort of credential misuse, which tells us that if we want to get some good bang for our buck when it comes to increasing our cybersecurity now today, we take credentials seriously.
Yeah, those are great points. So let's talk about some of the market conditions that are leaving credentials and privileges exposed. Carolyn, so this number of successful attacks is troubling. whether it be from cyber criminals or pen testers, but why is this happening?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of what John talked about too. I mean, Active Directory has really become such a hairball, right? Of old policies, and you mix in M&A changes, kind of compromising on things so that you get things to just work, right? You needed to get things functioning, and there's been fundamentally a lack of visibility tools to be able to tell not only when companies are not not having the policies, but maybe not complying with, or there's policy drift from things. And so some of the things that you see up here is, I think everybody knows that Active Directory is the keys to the kingdom and a prime target. But I think a lot of the recent ransomware attacks and large attack activity like SolarWinds that was out there really brought a spotlight to the fact that this is not being protected. It should be a top concern. And if we look at the difference in conversations a year ago to where they are today, they're very different, right? Now CISOs and other security teams are going, yeah, we kind of know, but it's kind of sat in this gap in between, our endpoint guys and our identity guys. And so who owns it? How do we work on it together? And just a lot has changed to come forward and say we need to collaborate better on solving these problems. We need to provide the security teams the visibility. There's definitely been a shortage, like in every IT arena, of staff that can not only go deep enough into this, but then also handle the script writing and other things. So, we all know it's quite tedious to go forward and to do that. And so sometimes it's on the list, right? You need to get to it, and it just takes time. So all of these things have collectively worked to create a situation. And then you throw cloud on top of it, right? And you start to go Active Directory in the cloud and cloud entitlements, and all of a sudden your issue just exploded, as did your attack surface. And the things that people now need to think about are, what does it look like from the endpoint? An ability to get to and compromise AD. What happens around AD that lets them get to the things that they want, and the credentials they need, and the privileges they need? And we've seen them jump between the cloud and prem to cloud and proud to cloud prem. So it's just a time that we need to spend more attention, because we see the consequences, as John talked about. It's not only operations, it's brand, it's sometimes welfare, of employees or patients. There's just a lot of consequences, in addition to just falling prey to a nasty ransomware, attack, and need to pay out or deal with the consequences. So it's time to pay attention. It's a lot of people say Active Directory is under siege, and it's not too much. It sounds dramatic, but it's not too much of an understatement right now.
Yeah, those are a hairball. That's a great a great term for what's going on.
Perfect.
So those issues seem pretty clear. Let's talk about what security teams are doing. So here's some more results from this survey. And let me go to John with this one. John, so this survey question was about protecting AD from advanced attacks. And you look at the bottom there, we're using identity detection and response tools, IDR. It's sort of the last one that shows up there, about 27%. What do you make of that? Are you surprised by the IDR adoption or anything else on here?
Here's another one where I'm not surprised. Again, you can kind of just look at it through a historical lens, and it doesn't seem so surprising. It built up, and these Active Directory installations, these architectures, these schemas have existed for decades, and the IT team is like, we've never really had problems with them. So, what's the big deal? And the fact is the current threat landscape is scary. And, what is well, I don't know about emus, so I guess I'll say ostrich. What does an ostrich do when it gets scary out, right? They stick their head in the sand. It's easier to just pretend it doesn't exist. And when we think about that and we take that analogy and we apply it to IT, what I'm really getting at is IT pros are overtaxed and overworked already. Okay. And so we're not in most organizations, including ours, we're not going through and we're saying, hey, we're going to add an identity management expert that's going to take on implementing and analyzing these IDR tools or whatever. We're going to take the person that already has 60 hours worth of work to fit into a 40-hour work week, and we're going to add this to them, right? And that person has to decide, what do I get at? Because something has to give, right? And it's easy to choose that thing that has never had a problem for 20 years and let it slip by the wayside. And the fact of the matter is, you put in an IDR system and it gives you great data and things you have to act upon. Well, now the problem exists. You are obligated to take action and fit it into your schedule and deal with it. So, that's kind of an ugly truth as far as I see it, but that's the way that I see it playing out right
now. Okay, and let me turn this one to Carolyn. And can you help the audience differentiate between identity solutions?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. And, identity is a big concern, right? And there's identity from the consumers and identity fraud and things that happen. But if you start to look at it from an enterprise standpoint, most people will think identity protection, your IAM, your PAM, your IGA solutions. And those are all good when you think about, provisioning, connecting, and controlling the identities that are out there. But what they don't focus on is securing the credentials themselves, the privileges, or the systems that manage them. And so what we're trying to do, and this webinar included, is to help educate people to understand that these are all important, but they're different and they fit together versus replacing things. And so what you need to think about as you look to secure your credentials and privileges and those cloud entitlements is, what kind of visibility tools do you have? Do they work within your bounds? Because as John mentioned, everybody's overworked, doesn't have time to go deep into a lot of this stuff. But, how deep can your visibility go so you can do the checks? How frequently are you doing them? How well do you communicate between cross teams to get things done? And then you have the other side, which is the identity detection and response. So first you're going to see your exposures, clean them up. But then the second is things are still going to go under attack. So how do you detect credential theft and misuse? How do you detect an attack on Active Directory? And those motions and those tools that are available are slightly different. And so even under identity security, people need to think about these two pieces and decide, where do they want to start, right? Do they feel like they don't have the visibility and they'd like to see the attack paths and the exposures and misconfigurations that are out there? Or do they feel like they've kind of got their hands around the majority of that and they'd like to see if somebody's doing, mass attack activity that would signify that Active Directory is under attack, for example, or somebody's maybe using a credential that they stole somewhere or they procured on the dark web, and now they're trying to use it, trying to, kind of be an imposter and mimic a real employee. So how do you put the credential protection of credential misuse in place to catch that activity? So two areas, identity visibility and identity detection and response, that I'd encourage people to think about in the context of identity security.
And what about EDR? How does that fit in?
Yeah, it's a piece where there's been a lot of attention. Even if you look at some of the congressional stuff that came out this morning, where CISA and others are going to start to look at endpoint security. And, you absolutely want your EDR solutions that are out there, but you also have to take a look at what they do. And what they don't do is that they don't look beyond that initial compromise activity. And so as the attacker's looking to move laterally, elevate their privileges, steal credentials, and you see the areas that are kind of grayed out. If you look at the ransomware kill chain, all of those steps that are grayed out are not covered under an EDR solution. So it doesn't mean that EDR is bad. EDR is quite good, but it plays a role, right? So you need to have your team in place, your team of tools in place, so that they can collectively play their roles and do their part. And that's where adding in the identity security pieces will come into play, because they'll detect when there's privilege escalation or credential harvesting or other lateral movement activity that you would want to detect. So again, I love the attention that's coming into play here, because it'll start to highlight, although EDR is great. You need to go beyond that. And you can't just look at those identity protection solutions we just talked about, because they don't cover this either, right? They're designed to cover more of the controlling and provisioning of access versus the credentials themselves.
Gotcha. And John, what about Jumpboxes? Any thoughts on those?
A lot. And, you know, they get some attention when it comes to security threats and that sort of thing, because most IT pros that are in security right now realize that cybersecurity isn't an event, it's a process. Right? It's not something that occurs at one point in time. And that goes directly to Carolyn's point of EDR isn't a single solution, right? And, you know, the press loves to sell things on, hey, do this and the problem all goes away. But that's not how it plays out with cybersecurity. Attackers are always looking at the long game, okay? Very rarely do they develop things that are designed for, you know, they either work in one step or they don't. It's a process. So they want to move laterally through a network. They want to gain one credential that, you know, could have the least amount of rights, and then simply manipulate and twist and try and get that to elevate. And jump boxes are a great tool for that. And you got to think about jump boxes outside of the conventional sense. And really look at them in very unique scenarios. So to give you an example, think about the IT pro that has a personal computer at home that, you know, they do everything from BitTorrent to anything elsewhere, and they decide to connect in from that machine one day when they get a call over the VPN into the corporate network. Well, you know, they just walked by a lot of your protections because your EDR solution probably isn't applied to their device. It may not even be registered in your Active Directory or whatever. And they think, well, it's no big deal, right? I'm really just an endpoint on the network long enough to do this thing or whatever. And they don't realize all the things that are happening in the background. And so now that malware can use that as a jump box into your network. They've just penetrated to the inside of the network. All they have to do is find a small foothold inside your network. And then after that machine disconnects, it doesn't matter. The seed's been planted. It's inside. It's past a lot of your defenses. You know, this is where zero trust comes in. And anybody who isn't thinking zero trust these days, they should go home and repeat it to themselves over and over for at least an hour.
All right. Zero trust, zero trust. So let's go to some more of the survey results. And John, as you look over these 80 attack concerns, what is it about these attacks that makes them so concerning?
So, like, here's one that I want to point out, particularly because we talked a little bit about the hairball that is Active Directory. Thanks, Carolyn. It's a perfect descriptor. And let's talk about Kerberos. I challenge everyone to go look at their network and look at how many of their authentication requests are actually still coming in via NTLM v1 or NTLM v2 and not even utilizing Kerberos, right? Kerberos was developed because those technologies were very flawed and abused and that kind of thing all the way back 20 years ago. And yet we're still seeing authentication requests on our networks today using those. And even if it's only, you know, a percentage of 1%, it's too many because you're talking about a security of vulnerability that attackers have had 21 years to develop technology and threats against. So these Kerberos attacks, they're attacking the modern replacement of those things. So it doesn't surprise me to see that kind of thing. And then, of course, AD privilege escalation. This is another one where we've had that creep over the years. And instead of really looking at least privilege that we should be looking at, it's theory that's been out there forever. Anytime someone has been like, oh, well, I need to access a file, instead of defining, you know, why do you need to access it? For what period of time do you need to access it? Who's going to approve the access? And when are we going to take it back? IT's just given access and then left it there. And so now you find some things that could even have, orphan SIDs on them, or accounts that person doesn't even remember they had access to a folder, or things like that, and they're showing up later. And these are the things that attackers gain a foothold with, and then escalate and move and escalate and move until they own your system, right? And then it's too late. And if people want some good information on zero trust, least privilege, those kind of things, I really suggest the NIST 800 series articles, the 800-53, 171, even 207, which is just to zero trust. Those are great articles that cover a lot of the details on some of the stuff we're getting into.
Yeah, and Carolyn, did you have something to add to that from some of the things that Mandiant has been talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting because, as John said, these types of attacks are, they're concerning, but they're pervasive. We see them all the time, as far as exposures that could leave windows open for attackers to be able to leverage these things and conduct their attack. But it was interesting. I was sitting on a webinar the other day where Nick Bennett, who's the vice president of Mandiant over there, one of the vice presidents over there, and when he was asked during the session, which was supposed to be about ransomware preparedness, a very simple question: why does this keep happening? And his answer was very clear. It's Active Directory, right? The attackers are out. They're exploiting the misconfigurations, the exposures that are happening, and that's what's allowing them to get in. And it's controlling the privileges, limiting the accounts that have these privileges. It's the lack of visibility to not only whether the policies are there and working as they should, but is there drift from the policies and compliance. And then the other piece, as I mentioned a bit earlier on, is it's not just looking at AD itself, but it's looking at the risk from the endpoint, right? And so how are they getting to Active Directory? And a lot of times organizations just simply lack the visibility that once that initial endpoint is compromised, they don't see anything until the actual exploit happens. And maybe they have some monitoring tools, but they're noisy. There's a lot of false positives and limited staff, so things just fall through the cracks. And so the piece that really resonated was wow, okay, even now you've got a big organization like Mandiant that's saying the number one reason is because Active Directory is vulnerable and it's being leveraged. And so it's all the more reason to look at things like this and go, okay, well, how do you stop this from happening? And it really starts with that visibility, right? Understand where those exposures, those risks, be able to detect if a live attack is happening. Because at this point, if you can stop them just when they're maybe using Bloodhound to try to enumerate Active Directory and just observing the environment, not a lot of damage is done. But if you wait until they've had an opportunity to change security policies or, spread malware around through your system, then it's a whole different level of cleanup and concern.
Gotcha. Great. Let's look at a couple of, or at least one more result from the survey about AD visibility and remediation challenges. And so, lots of challenges, related to identity security, or beyond downtime. So, there were clear remediation challenges related to assessment, understanding and analyzing data, and actionable guidance. John, what do you see here as some of the greatest challenges?
Well, so assessment is, really core to getting ahead of this thing, right? And because as Carolyn mentioned, AD is absolutely weak and a source of a lot of vulnerability, and we can address those things. But what's even worse is if you don't have a single identity management system and you've got all these one-offs. So for instance, you buy some HR system, and instead of using Windows authentication, you go in there and you create individual user accounts for your users. Besides the fact that administratively that's a big pain, what happens? Those users end up using the same password in that system that they use on your network with AD, and now you're reliant on the security that was built around that identity management in an application where they probably could care less about identity management, right? They need identities to allow people to get in and out. But, we talked about Kerberos and those kind of things. What level resources do you think those companies are devoting to come up with a better than Kerberos solution? They're probably not. So you need to make an assessment and make sure, first off, that you have a root identity management system. It's probably going to be Active Directory. That's the most common. And then you go forward and you assess Active Directory and start making improvements and enhancements, implementing protections. And the goal there is, or the benefit there is that because you did that first part, now those improvements affect the whole organization. You're not leaving holes. One of the big holes I see is a lot of people implement SQL Server and they leave SQL integrated authentication in place, right? The difference between SQL native authentication and Active Directory authentication is significant. And again, if users use the same credentials in both, it doesn't matter where they're exposed, right? It's the same concept. If they use their domain password out on Joe's, favorite crabs.com to create an account, then your domain is now only as safe as the security implemented by that website. So you have to be able to do these assessments and get visibility and know that the things that you're going to take control of and architect your solutions around are impacting the greatest base. As Carolyn said, the attacks are going to come because even though you tell people not to do that, there is no way you have that I'm aware of that you can stop someone from, logging in at an internet kiosk and creating an account on some website and use the same username and password that they use on your domain, right? You're not going to know about that until it's identified, and then it's too late. So the way I kind of take an assume breach stance, where I assume that there are vulnerable exposed credentials in the network. And so as Carolyn mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you have processes, procedures, systems in place so that as soon as they get a foothold and try and move, you catch them before there's any measurable damage.
Yeah, and
So,
just I'd add,
yeah.
sorry, Scott, didn't mean to cut you off there, but I just, and there's even some research that said, passwords 65% of the time get reused, like either exactly or some kind of iteration of it. And so back to that point, it's just so easy. You get something from one place and the door just got open a little wider for you to come sneaking on through. So.
Yeah. Well, so that's been a great overview so far of all the challenges related to identity security. But so for the next part, let's jump into what defenders can do. So, Carolyn, let me turn things over to you for a little bit to talk about that.
Awesome. Yeah, it's always great when you, hear all the challenges, but of course, it's like, okay, we all get it now, credentials and AD are at risk, but what do we do about it? And so what I want to do is predominantly spend time on the visibility piece of it. And because that is the most proactive thing that you can do is to go ahead and find those exposures and shut down those attack paths. So, Scott, if you mind going to the next slide. All right. So if you think about this, credentials being under attack, it's important to think about this from the context of it's not just one thing. As we mentioned before, there is, endpoints and users and devices. There's Active Directory, and there's all of the issues around AD in the cloud and the entitlements and the over-provisioning that happens over there. And so as you think about it from how an attacker is going to attack and as they migrate through these systems and thinking about what visibility can you get into seeing attacker activity. So both when they're looking at network and application passwords. And if you think about it, the way that these things are accessed are going to be a little bit different. Like you might have an attacker using Mimikatz in one scenario and using Lasagna in another scenario to go ahead and dump the credentials. And so what type of solutions do you have in place to be able to see where those credential exposures are first? And then, of course, you want to be able to detect if any activity is going on. so that you can prevent them from being able to leverage those things. And there's, as a side note, some pretty cool technology that's out there that will restrict even legitimate credentials from being used by an attacker. As an organization has used some of the tools that can bind those applications and the credential stores together so that they can't be used illegitimately. But let's, for now, focusing on the pieces: visibility to credential exposures, visibility to exposures and misconfigurations in Active Directory, and then looking at how you have visibility into cloud infrastructure entitlements, factoring in now you've got to think about the human and the non-human entities that you have to manage. And as we all know, in the cloud, those non-human entities just explode by a magnitude of, pick your number, but it's exponentially greater, the things that you're going to have to manage there. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so the first thing is taking a look at the exposed credentials and attack paths. And so there are tools that do attack surface management. They'll be able to tell you where those credentials are out on the endpoint. You may be able to see things like maybe an employee leaves and credentials are there, duplicate credentials. There's a whole bunch of visibility that you're going to pick up from here so that you can see and automatically remediate. So let's take step one and say, let's not make it easy for the attacker to be able to move from the endpoint over to Active Directory. Okay, if we go to the next slide. The next thing that you can do is take a look at Active Directory exposures. And this has really started to come into play in the last year with Attivo and a couple other manufacturers, including the guys over at SpectreOx, that have really started to look at this situation and go, how do you look at those attack paths? How do you look at the visibilities, and what do you do about it? And so in this case, what you can do is start using this to generate a health score and be able to see where your high, medium, low exposures are, and be able to track and trend for your management and other executive reporting about, are you getting better, and are you able to remediate the issues as they come up? You can see those results. As I mentioned earlier too, you want to look at things from both a domain, a user, and a computer level, and be able to see where you need to focus your attention and shut things down. The other things that you want to be able to see is see changes inside of the other trusts and forests, and see what those changes are, so you can again have some insight to say, hey, that shouldn't have been set up that way, and now I want to go ahead and investigate that more, and be able to get the information to do so. So we know, again, just to be able to get data without it being actionable is not that effective. So if I can have you, Scott, go to the next slide. The next thing that you can do is you can leverage the reporting that comes with. And this will flow a little bit into the DARE scenario, because this is what we had John take a look at. And I think we had about an hour and a half to do both the assessment and the reporting readout. And I think the results came back, in about under 30 minutes from when we got it running and coming back, that it will produce the information in that dashboard that you saw, but you'll also get a report inside of it that will describe, and it'll give you CVEs and MITRE attack information. It'll give you the mitigation steps. It'll give you the additional tool information about what was being used, and it'll give you references. And what makes this particularly interesting is that now it's very actionable, and something that potentially would have taken time to go research and understand what you needed to do will now all be provided. So as you look to write scripts or do other things, it all becomes very, very simple. So now you've been able to look at it to reduce your risk from the endpoint, close down those attack paths. You're able to look for exposures and misconfigurations inside of Active Directory, and you're able to get information that makes it very easy to remediate. John and I kind of talked a little bit about this too, because this system does over 200 checks. It also does some live attack detection pieces, which is kind of cool on top of it. But if we look at the automation that's here to do this, one of the questions that I had asked John as we were going through this is, well, if you did this yourself, right? Obviously you know and care a lot about identity. How long would it have taken you to be able to do this? And I think, John, you said it'd probably take you about 6 months, just because everybody's busy and splintered. But I don't know I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I don't know if you want to add on to that. But you definitely saw some benefit with being able to run this continuously or on demand.
Absolutely, and we'll get into that, but you're absolutely right. I said that it would take 6 months. And going a little further, I said, and that would be for an incomplete result, because trying to perform this level of analysis that takes 6 months, things get lost, things change along the way that never get readdressed. So the end result would not be as complete or inclusive as what we got. And just because a lot of the information is timely. So when it takes you 3 months or 6 months or whatever period of time to get it, that timeliness factor comes into play, and then accuracy goes down. So yeah, you quoted me accurately.
Yeah, yeah, so fantastic. But yeah, it was kind of interesting because I love getting that direct feedback, because our goal as we looked at developing this technology was to be able to make it very simple for people to see and to understand and take action. So as again, you look at the scenario, you've got endpoint, you've got Active Directory, and now you've got what happens in the cloud. So Scott, if we can go to the next slide. All right, so this is a different dashboard, obviously more extensive than what you were looking at before, because there's more things to be able to have to dig into. But what you're looking for here in this case is all those changes to the entitlements, how and when they changed, being able to drill into these over different time frames. So if you look at the little right-hand corner there, it'll show you basically how you can change and look at it from a granular basis. You can look at your entitlements, you can look at things by your users, your groups, your roles. You can look at things from very high, medium, low risk. And then it breaks it down into a variety of different things. And I think we had a really interesting conversation too, John, about MFA. It's part of your company's, policy and practices. And one of the things that John was curious about was, well, not only do I have my policy, but where do I see my drift? The people that are not actually following and complying with things. And so here what you can do is you can drill into things at a very detailed level. And I know this is super small inside of the screen there, but it's broken down into a whole bunch of different elements. So you can see things at a very granular level. And if you go to the next slide, because it might be a little bit easier given how small this is on the screen here. All right, then you can go into the individual entitlements. And part of the thing that's kind of cool about this too, and there is a different topographical view too, where you can see both outbound and inbound entitlements, because you want to look at it from a user to see, okay, well, what do they have access to? And then from the opposite side, what are they entitled to get to? And as we look at all the group policies that get set up, it's very often that people get access to something, and maybe they needed it for something temporary. And as John said, they just leave it open because people forget, or they didn't mean to have them associated, but somebody clones their profile and gives the access to somebody else. And it'll start to tell you, and all of a sudden you'll kind of work backwards and go, wow, okay, I did not realize because of that group association, now I have this whole stream of other people that have access into this database or other information that they really shouldn't be entitled to get to. And so again, great way to be able to look at these things, drill down into them, get the actionable information so that you know how to remediate things today. I think just in the spirit of time here, we're kind of staying top of the waves of things. But if people do want an additional demo, they are welcome to get in touch with Attivo. We'd be happy to give it. Same DARE challenge we gave to John. We do a free assessment for everybody, so I welcome you to take Attivo up on that as well. Take out the assessment and block about an hour and a half to go through the whole thing, and you should be able to get some feedback. So without further ado, I'm going to go back over to you, Scott and John, to talk about the DARE and how it went.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's get into the fun part of any truth or dare is always the dare. And so John, as part of the dare, you did an AD assessment with Attivo. What'd you find?
So, first off, let me say that I believe one of the pragmatic realities of the CISO role is that we acknowledge what it is, right? Whatever we find, we acknowledge, because by acknowledging it, then we can move forward to solutions. So that was very important to me, being my basic stance going into this, because I found a lot of things that I wasn't expecting. Remember, I used that head in the sand analogy earlier. Well, to some degree, I had my head in the sand. I believed certain things were addressed simply because I had always believed they were addressed. And the tool quickly, within the matter of a half hour, identified a number of those things that are in the current threat landscape, huge risks. And many of them are very low hanging fruit. They're easy for us to fix. They don't require a lot of investment. They don't require a lot of investment in terms of either time or money. They just require knowledge of them, right? And you don't know about them until you do the assessment, until you go and you look and you dive. And as we've been talking about all day today, doing that manually is cumbersome and time consuming. Yeah, you can do it with command line tools. You can do it with PowerShell scripting or whatever, but it still requires you to devote resources to that. And as I mentioned, they're already overworked, and so things give way, right? No excuses to be made here. But a few of the things that we found. One of the things that it's almost embarrassing, but I've spent the last couple of years proselytizing about is domain admins, right? How many organizations do you go into and their IT pros have domain admin level creds to, well, I have to log on to servers or whatever. You only need domain admins to do one thing and one thing only, and that's log on to domain controllers. Everything else can be done with a lower level privilege. And one of the things we found were endpoints where people assigned domain admin rights had logged into that machine as an administrator to install software or whatever. Well, guess what? That domain admin password just ended up cached on an endpoint. And now it's that same thing we talked about earlier, weakest link type scenario, right? An attacker can breach that cached credential on that endpoint. It's only as strong as the protections on that endpoint, and now you've got a problem. So we pointed out that. Another thing that's huge, and I know we're going to talk about insurance and compliance in a minute, so I won't get too far into that, but never expiring passwords. This was very common even just a few years ago, right? Oh, well, we have certain users that we don't make them change their passwords. The CEO doesn't have to change his password, right? The person on the plant floor, they can't be bothered. They're making widgets. They can't be bothered. Well, that can't happen today. Passwords have to cycle. And particularly if you're not using MFA, right? If you're only using a single factor authentication mechanism and it's a password, I know there's other recommendations out there that speak differently than this, but I am still entrenched with, if you're going to be single factor, you better be changing your password frequently and making it unique. And we identified quite a few. And so it was definitely bigger than a breadbasket, smaller than a planet kind of thing, but it was probably closer to the planet size that I want to acknowledge. So that was one. And then the final thing that I want to talk about that I kind of had my head in the sand about, but I was glad that we found, were dormant accounts. Okay. Remember those dormant accounts. They're just like those entitlements that Carolyn just spoke about, where they get assigned an additional entitlement and it doesn't get taken away. Well, now imagine if that occurs and occurs and occurs, and then all of a sudden that account goes dormant. So now it's not being taken care of or fed. It's just sitting out there waiting in a state to be compromised and then used against you. So in a very short order, we found things, and those are 3 examples, that we could take actions to remedy. And, I'll be very straightforward. We remedied those within a matter of a few days after finding them. So just doing the assessment provided direct value to the organization and allowed me to take my head out of the sand, I guess, and learn some things and fix some things.
That's awesome.
Carolyn,
love
any
the
reaction to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I love the feedback because, I know John was very confident. And as we're walking through, and I'm like, wow, this guy really has some impressive policies and guidelines about how they protect identities within their organization. So this is not where you're like, okay, let me take the weakest link I can find and go to show how much value we can prove. I was kind of sitting there going, okay, this guy's got his act together, and he's got a well-managed organization. And he had talked about the 2 audits that he had done and a couple hundred hours of assessment and activity. So I'm like, okay, he's on top of it. And as we're uncovering, and you see him kind of sitting up a little straighter in his chair and leaning into the screen, going, "Wait, what?" And
Yeah.
I'll refrain from sharing some of his quotes, but it was definitely a interesting exercise, and I was super happy that we found the value, but it also was something that was actionable, that within a couple days he was able to get things back into the range of what he wanted for his security risk profile, thinking about how this impacted him on compliance and other things. So again, just was a great experience with John to have him go through this. Very candid, never had seen it before. So really just seeing the immediate value come through.
And John, let me bring the survey back up for a second. Let's bring it back to that. When you look through these challenges and benefits of identity protection, I wonder if you can speak to some of these about the ways that the Attivo solution would be able to help you, or was able to help you.
So the 2 that I really want to focus on, because I think they are the biggest bang for the buck, right? They address directly what I was talking about, where you've got 60 hours worth of work, 40 hours to get it done, and now you're adding something on top of it, right? And so what things can we bring in that actually help us make sure that stuff we're adding on top of it doesn't get pushed to the side? And that's going to be the first item in the list and the last item into the list, right? Obviously, seeing the permissions gap, that's a huge part of what I just described. It's identifying and understanding the gaps between, and this may be a little different than what we're talking about here, but I think it's still similar, but the gaps between what your policy is, right? The policies and procedures you put in place, because as Carolyn mentioned, I am a big believer in that you cannot manage what you cannot measure, and part of measurement is having those policies and procedures in place that you can compare against and see what are we doing in relation to what we say we should be doing, right? And finding gaps in that is important, because let's talk a little bit about we talked about some of the other audits, and a lot of those you go through and you look at group policy settings and you go, okay, well, we have a password change policy in effect and that kind of thing. And so great, check mark, we're going to check that box. But then you find out that, again, you have a well-meaning IT professional that's checking the box that says password never expires. Well, that group policy just became null and void as far as that user goes. And it keeps going, and it builds over the 2 decades of that hairball forming. So understanding that gap is huge. And then also understanding the risk levels, right? Because certainly, as comes to everything, and I'm not negating what I said earlier about this as a pitch a shutout type scenario, but at the end of the day, you've got 100% to deal with, and most of your value is probably going to come in that first 80%, right? The 20% are going to be the exceptions that probably require a whole lot of resource to go in to fix or enhance, and the payback in terms of mitigating risk is going to be much less. So if we just focus on that first 80, and like the 3 examples I gave, those have huge payback in terms of shrinking our threat profile, but they required very little investment to get them done, right? The only thing that was really holding us up from those was the knowledge that they existed. And that's where the tool came in. And as you both have mentioned, I wasn't familiar with Attivo's tool set or whatnot when we began talking about this, right? And I was particularly confident, hopefully not cocky, but particularly confident in our policies and practices. And to me, I will say that actually that's the best time to do these kind of assessments, right? Is when you feel that you're really in good shape. There's little risk in doing an assessment, right? What's the worst that can happen? You spend an hour and a half like I did, and you find out that you were absolutely correct. Everything is nailed down, ready for the hurricane. Or the best that can happen is, in the case that we have here, we find some very easy to remediate things, and we remediate them. We change our practices and our policies to make sure they stay remediated, and we move forward, right? So great opportunity.
All right, that's great. And I'm just going to skip ahead on the compliance and insurance question just to make sure we have a little time for some audience questions. But I did want to ask John if there are any words of advice that you can give, for anybody who is, as far as for security teams trying to secure or justify, budget for identity security.
Yeah, so I'm just going to spend a couple seconds on that because the insurance and the compliance certainly come into here. Compliance has been nothing new. We've done that for years in insurance, but I spent a lot of time over the past year working with cybersecurity insurance carriers, understanding how they underwrite policies and things like that. Here's the big difference. In the past, IT would be presented with a questionnaire or a checklist, and they would fill it out, and that was kind of the end of it, right? And so what's shifted now is the same kind of thing happens, but in the event you need to make a claim, there's a lot more scrutiny coming back to make sure that the claims you made match the practices you put in place. And guess what happens if they don't match up one-to-one? You get denied. And so that $10 million ransomware claim that you thought you were going to get paid off, and they find that, oh, you answered, we have MFA in place, and they found out that you really didn't have MFA in place. You had kind of a pilot program going where you only had it on 10% of your users. Well, that's basis for, hey, if you would have told us that going in, we would have told you, no, that's not good enough. You have to have MFA. And I mention MFA specifically because there's some data out now that shows that the majority of cybersecurity insurance carriers are requiring MFA implementations beginning already, but certainly in 2022 when that renewal comes up, you're going to see a lot more focus on that. So if you're not doing MFA, you better be prepared to. And if you attest you have MFA and you prove you don't, it could come back to bite you and be very expensive for your company. So explaining that change in the shift of insurance policies and protecting the company from risk and mitigating the risk appetite for the company, that is all key to going to your C-suite and getting money designed just to target cybersecurity threats, right? When you say, hey, we as a company, why do we have all these insurance policies that we want? Well, because as a company, we want to mitigate risk against things like fire, flood, right? Loss of production, any of those kind of things. Well, same reason. Why does a company invest in a cybersecurity insurance policy? Because when something happens, they want it to pay out. And if IT isn't doing the things, if IT doesn't have the resources or the budget necessary to do the things necessary to keep that security insurance in place, well, you're paying it to make yourself feel better, not to actually produce an end result. And I don't know any executive anywhere that's going to support that, right? That's going to buy off on it. Hey, we need this insurance, and we better be investing to make sure that if we ever need it, it's there for us. Because at the end of the day, ransomware is real. If it hasn't struck near you, I mean, I live in one of the smallest population counties in Ohio, and in our county alone, we've had 3 takedown level ransomware events with loss of production, loss of revenue, those kind of things in the county in 2021 alone, right? And so that should alone be enough to spur people into having the conversations with their C-suite on getting the investment necessary to make their threat exposure smaller, right? You're never going to eliminate it, but if we were at a fair and you were looking at a bunch of targets and you're trying to win the stuffed animal, right? And the targets are all different size. Do you aim at the smallest one or do you aim at the easiest to hit ones? And I tell everybody that threat actors always aim at the bigger ones first. So if you can do nothing else, make yourself the smallest target on that shelf.
Yeah. So we're almost up on time, but I do want to take a little time for some audience questions. And while we're looking at questions, I've got a poll question here. I'm most concerned about improving my security for, and then the answers are local credential protection, Active Directory protection, or cloud entitlement management. So if you could answer that while we're thinking about our first question. We have one from Katerina. And it's an interesting question. She's asking, how about sysadmins using the domain admin accounts for everything? John, it didn't sound like you had a lot of examples of that, but Carolyn, I wonder if that's something that pops up regularly, as you, run your tools across other clients.
Yeah, sorry, can you just say that one more time? I just want to make sure I caught the.
Carolyn, if you guys don't mind, I'll jump in. Let me just remind you that. So the question was asking about, sysadmins, IT pros that are using domain admin level creds to do administrative tasks on things that aren't domain controllers. And you might, right? And you might remember I mentioned that earlier. You only need domain admin level to log into domain controllers. So if they're using that account on anything that isn't a domain controller, bad juju, right? And if your domain controller has things like DNS running on it, you don't need a domain admin level account to even manage that, right? You just need a GIA endpoint or something else with administrative capability to do that. The domain admin level account is very small in the things it's necessary for. So if you can make an improvement that's easy and cheap to make, get people out of that domain admins group and get them in a normal server admins group with lower entitlement. And I'm sure Carolyn's gonna back me up on that one.
Absolutely, couldn't have said it better. I mean, it's absolutely correct. And then, like I said, you add the visibility tools to be able to see where your exposures are and where things shouldn't be, and that will also help you mitigate, the situation. And then there are some times when you do have to have certain privileged credentials that are out there, and there are things that you can now do with concealment technology that will actually hide those credentials from the attackers. There are things that also can do the same thing around 80 objects. And so I would encourage you to take a look. If you're in an environment where you maybe can't get that as tight as you would want, use some of the credential protection and Active Directory detection and response tools. And then be able to mitigate your risk in that way. But I'm with John totally on, they should not be used in a broader way.
Great. And so one more poll question up here, just asking if you'd like to be contacted by Attivo Networks for a free assessment or demo. So you can go ahead and answer that, please. But it looks like we're on time. But Carolyn, if somebody wants to get started with you guys, what do you recommend?
Yeah, easiest thing, if they don't know who their local rep is, they can always go to the website and they can come in. There's lots of forms they can fill out for either demo or contact or the free assessment. And there's a lot of things you can just go in and read if you want to become more familiar with the different technology from either a product or solution standpoint. So, and again, feel free to hit up anybody from Attivo on LinkedIn or otherwise. I mean, we're always happy to chat. have a conversation around things. But again, really, appreciate John, his time and stuff. It's a really important topic that needs to get a little bit more, attention applied to it. And there are some tools that just didn't exist before, to give the visibility and that attack detection. So I'd encourage people to take a look and help reduce their risk by using some of those tools and tech.
Well, Carolyn and John, thanks for an interesting presentation. That was a fun approach. I really appreciate your time, both of you, on making this happen, and it was really, really great information. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks to both of you. It was my pleasure.
And mine as well.
And before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the prize drawing for the $300 Amazon gift card. And the winner is Bill Moschella from Pennsylvania. So congratulations to Bill. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Attivo Networks again for making this event possible. And I'd also like to thank everyone who attended and for your, for your attention and for your questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.